May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So, who knows where God lives? What is God's address? I'm looking at the kids back there. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, God's country. Maybe you even use that phrase, God's country, to describe where you live or maybe where you're from. My husband uses that phrase, God's country, to describe where he's from, Rankin County, Mississippi, although he clarified this morning. He said God's country is actually a particular part of Rankin County. Is it the northeast part of Rankin County? So if you're looking for God's country, northeast Rankin County is on the list of contenders. But here's the thing, is that I've heard lots of competing claims about where God's country is. I have friends from Texas. They say that Texas is definitely God's country. I see Dawn nodding here. And then I have a friend from West Virginia, and he says that really West Virginia is God's country. And then just to make matters even more complicated, I've heard that really we need to think more broadly than the United States, because there are places like Yorkshire, England, and Kerala, India, that really consider themselves to be God's country. So where is God's country? What is God's address? In our journey through the Bible, we have arrived at the story of King David. And there are really a lot of stories about King David. King David gets a lot of time in the Bible. There's David and Goliath, and there's the conflict between David and Saul, and then there's the whole Bathsheba incident. But what King David is known for, maybe more than anything else, is insisting that God does not only have a country, but also a specific address, and that address is in Jerusalem. Our reading from 2 Samuel today comes just after David has moved the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And he didn't just move it. He didn't just pack it up in a truck and haul it into Jerusalem. He moved it with all kinds of fanfare. He moves it surrounded by people playing music and himself kind of wildly dancing in front of it all the way to Jerusalem. This gives you an idea of how important it is, right? The Ark of the Covenant holds the 10 Commandments, but even more than that, it's seen as being imbued with the presence of God. It's seen as wherever the Ark goes, the essence of God is kind of going with it, wherever it is. So that's why in our reading today, we start to hear David be a little bit concerned about the idea that while he himself is living in this cedar palace, the Ark of the Covenant, where the presence of God is, lives in a tent, something not quite as grand as what he is living in. And David wants something better than that for God. So David kind of hatches this idea. He thinks he knows where God should live, that God should live in a temple, something much bigger and grander and worthy of being the dwelling place of the Most High. All of this is sounding good, except that there is just one problem with David's plan. That is that God disagrees. We hear God's thoughts as channeled through the prophet Nathan, and that was what most of our reading was God speaking through the prophet Nathan. And this is what God says in response to this idea of David building him his own home. God says, "I have not lived in a house since the day I brought the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent and tabernacle." In other words, it sounds like God has gotten pretty used to camping, to traveling, to being on the move. God seems to like tents. And God doesn't sound sure at all about this plan to kind of settle down in one place and to establish residency and to have a fixed address. God's not so sure about that at all. So instead, God kind of flips David's plans on their head and says that instead of David building God a house, God's going to be building a house out of David. God is going to be the one at work here. the one in charge, which really is as it should be, right? God will be establishing a dynasty out of David's family, establishing David's throne forever, and keeping a covenant with David just the way God has kept God's covenant with Noah and with Abraham and with Moses. This is another covenant that God plans to keep. And this idea, this covenant, this relationship is much more important to God than this idea of settling down in one place. We, of course, know about this promise that God made to David because of how we see it fulfilled in Jesus, who, after all, was known as the Son of David. By the time Jesus is born, it will have seemed as if David's line, his family tree, has come to an end. The kings who followed David, so first his son Solomon, and then others on after Solomon, rule over a divided kingdom, and then eventually peter out. They're long gone by the time Jesus comes along. The kingdoms that they had ruled over, these kings after King David, these kingdoms have been conquered, first by the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then later, at the time of Jesus, by the Romans. Hope is just about lost that anything could still come from David's family tree. But that is that moment when Jesus comes along, when we really learn where it is God lives. This transient God, this tent-dwelling God who moved around with the people from Egypt to the Promised Land, who will follow them into exile when they're exiled from Jerusalem. This God who seems to prefer, in fact, tents to temples and buildings. This is the God who is always ready to do a new thing. And this is the God that we meet in John's Gospel later when we hear that the Word was made flesh and dwelled among them. Or as my favorite translation puts it, God pitched his tent among us. So God takes up residence in the form of Jesus. In order to get even closer to us, God makes this particular branch of David's family tree his new address. So if you really want an address for God, Jesus is God's address, God's dwelling place. Sometimes we might catch ourselves acting like King David, thinking that God maybe belongs in a church. Or we might think that God belongs inside a religious tradition, a particular denomination. We might think that's where God is. Or sometimes we might think that God belongs inside of our own expectations, our own imagining, our own ideas of what God looks like and acts like. We might think that it's our job to build a home for God, a container, or even maybe a theology, and lots of people do this, something that explains how it is, how God moves and acts and is in the world. Our story that we heard today about David reminds us that we worship a God who cannot be contained. A God who can't be contained by buildings, can't be contained by a beautiful church, a God who can't be contained by denominational lines, a God who can't be contained even by our own preconceptions, a God who resists easy answers and explanations. This is a God who is always on the move. And our God has always gone out in front of us, leading the way through the wilderness and parting rivers, even doing this new thing of taking on flesh in order to reconcile the world. Our God is always up to something new. Even now, our God is up to something new, and always in the middle of that calling us to something new, to seeing how God is doing something new. There's nowhere that this tent-dwelling God can't go. This week, this image of a tent-dwelling God has been helping me as we look around the country and see our rates of coronavirus just peaking. Things have not been good this week. There have been a lot of people getting sick and a lot of people dying. But this image of a tent-dwelling God on the move has been comforting to me. I have been picturing this tent-dwelling God setting up a tent in all kinds of places. So I've been picturing God setting up a tent in intensive care units, in hospitals around the country, even around the world, being with the people who need medical care right now. I've been picturing this tent-dwelling God setting up a tent in nursing homes where residents are isolated and missing family and missing friends and missing human connection. I've been picturing this tent-dwelling God setting up a tent in funeral homes where people are grieving and confused and mourning and needing God's presence. I've been picturing our tent-dwelling God setting up a tent in the homes of people who are trying to stay home and stay safe. Setting up a tent with all of our essential workers who are out in the community working to keep things running for all the rest of us. Setting up a tent with burned out parents who are stretched too thin, and also isolated people who are living alone, who are lonely. I want you to think about where you might see this tent-dwelling God setting up a tent, pitching that tent in your own life. So where is it that you are scared or lonely or confused or in need? I want you to watch that place in the next week. Watch for a tent to go up there, because I believe those are the places where God comes and sets up a tent. Watch for God to surprise you in those places, showing up where and when and in the form that you might least expect. So, where is God's country? What is God's address? Look all around. God is on the move, and there's no telling where God's tent is going up next. Amen.